Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about the state budget. You can join our discussion by calling us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Anthony Hennon, reporter for the Center Square. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You write that the Shapiro administration will spend roughly $11 million on making business sites shovel-ready. What assurances does the governor have that making such investments will result in attracting business to Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so this is part of a broader strategy he's using here. This $11 million is already in the budget. In his proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year, he's proposing up to $500 million to do some of the same. This idea of, take these former factory lands or brownfields, revamp them so we can have new advanced manufacturing industries come in. This is something that again and again he's argued. Places like Ohio and New York already investing a lot more in this than Pennsylvania does. Maybe 200 million or 400 million a year. So Shapiro's arguing this is a way to catch up to neighboring states. Some of the $11 million will go to, I believe, about 7 projects statewide. And he's arguing that with these 7 projects, essentially the state kicks in some money to build, highway improvements or electrical connections or sewer upgrades. And then we already have other businesses coming in to put in even more money to revamp this. So this is kind of Shapiro's argument of if we put in a little, private business will put in a lot, and then that can lead to growing Pennsylvania, creating more jobs.
Can you talk a little bit more about where these sites will be located and how these first initial sites were selected?
Yeah, so one of them is, Shapiro last week spoke out in Westmoreland County at a former land. We're also seeing some pop up in Wayne counties, up in the Lehigh Valley, places like this, essentially hoping that this kind of relies on what we're seeing with some of the past manufacturing in Pennsylvania. Thinking either, a former aluminum site, or former, in some cases, mining lands or brownfields. They're basically, there's some issues with it, but there's ways to improve it, ways to grow it. I think what we'll see as these pop up, it'll be mainly around areas like Allentown, Pittsburgh, some of the bigger hubs in the Commonwealth.
Now, you hinted at this a little bit, but can you talk more in detail about what kind of infrastructure is needed, what needs to happen to these sites to make them more attractive to businesses?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where each site is unique in its own problematic ways. Some of them is going to be highway improvements of either, revamping these roads or maybe expanding them. Others are making sure, you have the proper electrical hookups. Some of this is railroad infrastructure. The idea here is at least not necessarily taking every abandoned site or abandoned industrial site and revamp it. The idea here is to look for ones that, already have some potential or already have a lot of what is needed. There's just some minor upgrades that need to be made, or maybe a couple million here, 5 or 6 million there, and then that would prompt 20, 30 million in private investment. I think this is one of those things where Shapiro keeps repeating again and again that he's competitive, that he wants to get stuff done. But at the same time, a lot of these comparisons are made with neighboring states, with New Jersey, with New York, with Ohio. But what we've heard from critics is also, these are not the leading states. These are neighboring states. But just as we're competing with Ohio or New York, we're also competing with North Carolina or with Texas or with Arizona. So there's this idea that we need to look beyond just our neighbors to really be nationally competitive. There's also this concern of, I think, there's some important work to be done here for site development. But at the same time, you also hear from business leaders or from critics, as annoying as these costs can be, one of the bigger problems is permitting or getting approvals moving faster. So I think this is one way to approach economic development, but we also need to keep in mind that they're the basics of making sure you can quickly get permits, the basics of making sure you can get approvals or license or whatever to do. The more we make some fundamental reforms and speed that up, I think we'll see all across Pennsylvania the potential for business growth.
As you talk about other sites that have made investments in site development, is there any evidence that other states that make these investments find more success attracting businesses?
Yes and no. I think when you look at these things, you look at the mention of Ohio attracting an Intel plant coming to town. But at the same time, that is also done with some hefty subsidies behind them, state and federal. So we do see some success of these things rolling in. Or you look south, you look at South Carolina and some luck that they've had with developing automotive manufacturing. But at the same time, it's a bit risky, right? Because we're putting a lot of money into this, but this is not necessarily a guarantee of success. So I think, looking at the Shell plant up in Western Pennsylvania has been another sort of example of this, not necessarily site development, but the same strategy. Where we can see the wins, but at the same time, there's a lot of money going in, and there's a lot of questions of whether this will be long-term economic growth or whether this is just one-off or a shot in the dark.
Has the state, perhaps particularly the Department of Community and Economic Development, set any sort of benchmarks to determine whether or not this is a successful endeavor?
I believe so. The head of that department, Rick Seiger, has been very positive about trying to work with businesses and figure out where these pressure points are, what the state can do, how the state can do things differently to, kind of help develop the state economically. But I think this is one of those things where time will tell. And there's also this big question of whether this will remain in Shapiro's budget as we start approaching budget season and the deadlines for making things happen. Who knows if this will be 500 million or if this gets knocked down or what exactly happens here.
Since you mentioned the budget process and the fact that the governor, at least initially, proposed an additional $500 million towards site development, what kind of reaction are lawmakers having to this proposal?
Yeah, I think this is part of, it's very difficult to get a budget done on time in Pennsylvania anyway. Most of the talk has been around, Senate Republicans proposing a tax cut, once again, lifeline scholarships and trying to fund more school choice. I don't think this is going to necessarily be a major play here. Last week when Shapiro was out in Westmoreland County, State Representative Eric Nelson was also out there supporting it. So I think there's at least some level of Republican support for these efforts. How influential or primary in mind these things will be, we'll see in a few months.
Anthony Hannon, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests today are Charlie Gerow, CEO of Quantum Communications, and former Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor Mike Stack. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. We're roughly 6 weeks away from the budget deadline or so. Looking back at past administrations, are there certain tactics or dynamics that you think work really well in legislative leadership that help to move a budget through quickly?
You're the pro there, Gov. You were in the room all the time.
Tactics, you always feel like somebody's going to have a game plan to execute this thing by June 30th. And a lot of times, rank and file members, whether in their House or in the Senate, count on their leaders to help put this thing on the tee. And then sometimes the leaders are the last to know from what's going on the other side. So the game plan really is, I think we've established where the governor is right now, where he wants to go. And we've established, at least in the Senate, where the Republican majority would like to go, and with a number of Democrats too supporting a tax cut. So I think at least, which is really what is really important, is you at least have the baselines of where the governor wants to be, where the Republicans want to be, and now we've got to see where the Democrats in the House want to be. So it's room to talk, but in between that is going to be mayhem and horse trading and politics and schmoozing and maybe also cajoling. So that's got to play out right now.
I knew we'd get to the heart of things. Schmoozing and cajoling is the key to the legislative tactics and strategy. I think the governor laid out pretty well, Francine, where we are in terms of the two sides' positions. How they work out those positions is going to be very interesting. You've got some interesting folks on the various appropriations committee, one of whom is Vince Hughes. And although he and I break lances on television, I've always gotten the sense that if I were in the Senate, I'd be able to work things out with Vince. When you push all the rhetoric aside, I think he does have a pretty level head. On the Senate side, you've got Scott Martin and Seth Grove, both of whom are seasoned guys, know how this process works. I think that what happened in the Senate last week with a bipartisan approval of a tax cut, which is a tremendous move in the right direction for Pennsylvania, really teased things up nicely and in sharp contrast to what Governor Shapiro wants.
Let's talk a little bit more about what happened in the Senate last week. Senate Republicans, as you mentioned, passed their version of a budget bill, basically, that takes a portion of the surplus to provide personal income tax relief. What's the purpose of that tactic, knowing that we have a divided legislature and the House probably is not going to pass this?
Well, I think it's, Francine, that you've always got the two polar opposites, and they somehow come to the middle sometime in the middle of July. I don't think anybody's holding their breath for June 30th right now. But I think what the Senate Republicans did, with the help of a good number of Democrats, by the way, was very, very important. You know, we talk about this rainy day fund like it's something that fell down from heaven like manna. These dollars are the taxpayers' money, and it ought rightly to go back to them. And at a time when an awful lot of folks are having trouble making ends meet, tightening their budgets, et cetera, government ought to be doing the same thing. It ought to be giving relief to Pennsylvania taxpayers who are long overdue for it.
What do you think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we had a rainy day fund in the early 2000s, too, and we would always discuss in the Senate, what are we going to do with the rainy day fund? And eventually, rainy days came and went many times over, and then we were running deficits, and so things change, and that's a fact. I mean, we're in a great state, we're in a great situation now with the surplus, but who knows what could happen? I think you talk about the priorities of Governor Shapiro. He wants to spend. He wants to spend $3 billion, and Republicans essentially have the polar opposite idea, you know, of a tax cut of about $3 billion. If you look at the quality of life in Pennsylvania, things are more expensive to people, the cost of food and fuel and things like that. So they don't feel that surplus necessarily. And I think the benefit psychologically of some kind of a tax cut, you know, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or independent, you know, and somebody tells you you're getting some money back, that sounds like a good idea. But so I think that Governor Shapiro has got some work to do to like convince folks that, you know, say any tax cut is probably de minimis in comparison to the kind of economic growth you can create by his economic programs and further investing in Pennsylvania. As Charlie pointed out, too, the number of Democrats who voted for the tax cut, the Republican plan, it's well over a third of the Senate members, and they represent Lehigh, which is an area that's often moderate, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Northeast Philadelphia, where I'm from, and Charlie used to be from. So they're sort of the blue dog Democrats that want to vote for a tax cut. So that's essentially an issue that is good for the Republican majority, and it's a problem for Governor Shapiro.
And I think it's important, Francine, that we're clear on the fact that Governor Shapiro doesn't want to let that rainy day fund sit alone and be used for a rainy day down the road. He wants to spend that money. And the problem with these one-time spends is that in the next budget cycle, what the heck do you do? We saw that with Tom Corbett when he was accused of cutting spending on this massive. Well, he spent there was a one-time spend by Ed Rendell that we knew was never going to be replicated, and there was poor Tom Corbett to take the fall from that. Now, Josh Shapiro has great ambitions, so the question's going to be, if he has this one-time spend, and by the way, his budget calls for spending in excess of what the Commonwealth believes it's going to take in next year, so it's a deficit plan right from the start. If he takes that one-time use of the rainy day fund, what are they going to do to replicate that spending in the next cycle?
Are Senate Republicans serious in their proposal to spend down part of the surplus?
I think they are.
What gets accomplished by moving this bill, even though the likelihood is that it's not going to go through the House? Does this move the budget process further?
Sure. It gets everyone activated, and whether they react emotionally or intellectually, what you want in the legislature, what you want in the Capitol, is people reacting and taking action rather than sitting around saying what's going to happen. So I think it's teed up actually conveniently to do, say, a variation of a tax cut, maybe less than the Republicans are calling for, and then for Governor Shapiro to still spend, but less, substantially less, and then everybody can take credit. Say the Republicans can say we knocked down the governor on his excessive spending, and the governor can say I'm moving forward, and I figured out a plan with the legislature, and that's why I'm a leader and I get things done.
And Francine, I don't disagree with Governor Stack, but I will say, just in amplifying what he just said, if the Senate Republicans had sent over a totally partisan plan, it would be a very different dynamic than the one they sent over. Because of the significant number of Senate Democrats that voted for that package, there are now going to be Democrats in the House that are going to be saying, no, wait a minute. I mean, I think of Frank Burns, for example, and the margin in the House, as you know, is razor thin. You don't need to move too many Democrats in order to be successful. So I'm not sure at all that this is dead on arrival over at the other side of the building. And
I really agree with Charlie's assessment on that. I mean, even if the Democrats had an even more sizable majority, you're still going to have the people from the same kind of regions that were in the Senate that voted for the tax cut in an election year, and it's always an election year for seemingly for the House. So yeah, that's a big issue, and there's going to be a lot of arm twisting and horse trading and convincing to go on. But there's still time to do it, but it just evaporates so quickly, the amount of time. And then you're in the middle of the summer, and everyone's family is saying, when are you coming home? When are we going on vacation? And the pressure builds to pass that budget.
Some of Governor Shapiro's budget proposals include concentrating a lot of funding on areas like mass transit and education. What happens to these areas if they don't get increased in this budget?
Well, we are getting outspent by our surrounding neighborhoods, or surrounding neighbors, other states. Mass transit, is always an issue in Pennsylvania that we're trying to invest in. We need to improve the quality of mass transit. More people should take public transportation and save us in so many other ways, environmentally and saving on fuel costs and all those other things. So we have tracks that are still falling down. We have infrastructure that's coming unglued. So we need to invest in that. The question is, how much do we need to invest? The Fed can also help us with that. So we need to figure out ways to match with what they're providing us. And then education. I mean, the public education system in Philadelphia has always been a challenge. Statewide, it's very important. There are communities that count on public education, but in Philadelphia, you have potential layoffs. You have less people in the public education system, and those that are in it are poor and challenged, and special ed issues continue to be exasperated. So we need to invest because it ends up being a longer-term social problems when you don't. So we'll have to see how that plays, because it all is going to come down to what amount.
Charlie, your thoughts on the governor's proposals, particularly concentrated on transportation and education? Yeah,
I mean, we had a very, very large transportation funding bill not that long ago, and that does, or should anyway, take care of a lot of the infrastructure issues. The giant sucking sound, of course, is mass transit, particularly in the two large cities. We have talk about mass transit in the mid-state, but it always fails because people simply don't want to use mass transit here. I've often said, find me the person who's going to wake up one morning, say, I'll get in my car, drive to the bus stop, park my car, get on a bus, go at exactly the same time, repeat the process at the end of the day, and the rain, snow, hail, or sleet, to go fight. Well, they're just simply not going to do that. So it is a particularized problem in the two major cities, and bluntly, they've got to take care of a lot of that problem. On the education side, I think that one of the things that is going to come to the fore again are the past scholarships, because that has been a significant political issue. It should continue to be. That is a lifeline to the children that Governor Stack was talking about a moment ago, rather than just increasingly adding to the burden on Pennsylvania taxpayers for education, both at the secondary and higher levels, without the accountability and without the results that we should demand.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Well, right, and then it's an ongoing issue on both sides of the aisle and among independents that people feel you want them to feel service-oriented and connected to the state, and say, well, it's good that we have a good public education system, so I don't mind paying tax dollars into that. But more often than not, you have families that don't have children in the public education system, and they say, I'm funding this and not benefiting from it. So that's a problem. They do benefit in the long run if it's done the correct way, because we have better citizens, smarter people who can invent things and create jobs and make our world a better one to live in. But in a grassroots level, when people are worried about other expenses, this continues to be a sticking point. So that requires more salesmanship as well.
The budget surplus should have roughly $14 billion by the end of the year. However, Pennsylvania still has an ongoing structural deficit. How do you marry the two of those as you're planning budgets not only for this coming year, but years in the future?
Well, I think that's one of the big challenges. And I mean, in this budget that Josh Shapiro is proposing, he wants to spend more than the Commonwealth believes they're going to take in. And that is a major problem. I mean, it is a gigantic spending piece, and bluntly, the people of Pennsylvania simply can't afford it. So I think that one of the things that has to happen is we've got to trim the sails a little bit. We've got to figure out what the core spending is that's really required to make the trains run on time, et cetera, to borrow an analogy from your transportation question, but to live within our means. And right now, the Shapiro budget doesn't ask us to do that.
What can the state do to reverse this structural deficit?
Well, I agree with Charlie that perhaps you need to scale down what your vision is for the amount of resources that you want to spend. On the one hand, Governor Shapiro is in a really good position. But does he play just for this year, or does he play for the long-term future? And I think more and more we make this analogy about state budgets that it's much bigger and vaster, but it's still a family trying to live within its means and plan for the future and to be able to afford all the things and be ready for the unanticipated costs. So I think how do you plan that long term? You have to plan that long term.
You've both been involved in state politics for a long time now.
She just called us old, Mike.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm not far behind. But looking back, are there individuals that you can point to and say, this was a good deal maker, this is a person that we should maybe learn lessons off of to move the process forward?
Well, Dick Thornburg was a good deal maker. Yeah. Ed Rendell was a good deal maker. If you want one from each side of the aisle, those are the two I'd pick.
I thought that Rendell was a good deal maker because he was flexible, and some people would say that you would go into a meeting with him and get a commitment and then walk out, and then he gave the exact opposite commitment to someone else. But he also had an ability to you wouldn't get mad at him, and you wouldn't hold it against him, and you knew that was just Ed Rendell. But the key thing was he kept talking to people and trying to get a deal done. And I think you got to have that kind of personality. You got to roll up your sleeves. You got to be willing to talk to everybody, and you cannot get too tied up in your, I don't want to say values, but you need to stay flexible on what your priorities are, and I think he was great at doing that.
We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our guests a brief break and tell you about what's coming up on PCN. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow morning. We'll discuss voter ID with House State Government Committee members Representatives Joe Webster and Brad Roy. That's tomorrow morning live at 9 a.m. Join us for On the Issues this week. We sit down with Representative Natalie Mihalik to discuss her bill to ban artificial dyes in food, followed by an interview with the Secretary of Labor and Industry, Nancy Walker. That's Wednesday night, starting at 7. If you enjoy PCN's coverage of politics and policy, sign up for our political newsletter, the PCN Capitol Preview. There you'll find highlights of the day's news, along with links to live event coverage and PCN original shows. To subscribe, visit PCNTV.com. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no state government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. And just a reminder, our phones are open. If you'd like to join our discussion today, you can call us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or send your question via text 717-219-4001. As we're talking about the state budget, I'd like to shift our focus to education specifically. In the past year or so, there was a Commonwealth Court decision, as well as a report from the Basic Education Funding Commission, both calling for more education funding. How does that marry into what this budget product might look like this year?
Well, obviously, we've underfunded underprivileged kids, and the court has decided that. Whether I can't figure out how binding it is, whether they can force us to spend, but it certainly creates some kind of impetus and moral authority that shows that this is not politics. We need to do a better job. And then that's one of the reasons that Governor Shapiro, I think, has authorized such a sizable increase in education funding. So the bottom line is it's something that we need to do better at dramatically, or we're violating the Constitution. And who are we as people and leaders if we say we're allowing an unconstitutional educational system that persecutes one group that deserves to be treated equally and have equal opportunity.
Charlie, do you think money is the sole fix for education?
It's not, clearly. I mean, we've spent more and more and more and more, and we haven't gotten the results or the accountability that, as I say, the taxpayers of Pennsylvania deserve. What's interesting about the court decision was it was a very lengthy opinion, as you know, but it didn't, in the final analysis, say, here's the number. So there's a gap there that has to be filled by an awful lot of discussion and an awful lot of work on the part of the legislature. They basically dropped this thing in the legislature's lap. I alluded earlier, though, to the past scholarships, and I think there is an issue that Republicans and Democrats ought to be able to agree upon, and Josh Shapiro ought to be able to keep his word on, because, as you know, he promised to be for it, but then when he had the opportunity to do so, he line-item vetoed it out.
We're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but first, a quick phone call. This one, John is calling from Easton. Go ahead, sir.
Hi. I was wondering if you guys could explain to me why you treat education funding and infrastructure funding like it's a corporation. I mean, like it's like they're a corporation. You budget money 20 years ago to fix the railroad tracks in Philadelphia or something, and they're still complaining that they're not done. They're not fixed. Or you're fixing the school system to teach better in these cities and expansion out in the suburbs, and they're creating school system, but you never accomplish anything in the education system either. You have to treat those two funds, those two things, like an American corporation. But don't jump up and pay them money every time they scream they need money, or they're going to raise taxes, or they're going to raise the price of everything. You got to put the hammer down and say, hey, why isn't this fixed now when I gave you $20 billion last year? And why isn't this fixed here because I gave you $10 billion last year? You got to look at what you're spending the money on. You don't just give it to them. You got to make sure it is done before you even do something else.
I wanted to follow up after Charlie said that anyway, and I think the caller's got a point in that we don't want to throw money at situations just to say, well, we threw a certain amount of money and therefore that's a result. In public education, I say this as a Philadelphian who's watched the system fail years after years after years, and I've supported charter schools in my old Senate district because it offered options for innovation and creativity. And I think that you need to have absolute benchmarks for the amount of funding that you get, meaning that if you don't reach certain performance, and whether it's and I'm not the hugest proponent of standardized testing, in fact, but you have to have some kind of benchmark of performance. And if you can demonstrate that you've succeeded with the amount of money that you receive, then you would get an incentive to get more. And that's sort of a corporate private sector concept. The same thing in the Army. We had to show benchmarks with our performance level. We needed to do that on transportation. We can't have the same situations over and over again. I think the gentleman's talking sort of like anecdotally sometimes, because I do the same thing. I'll see something dilapidated, unrepaired for a long period of time, and I presume the whole system's like that. But if you have enough of those incomplete transportation situations across the state, the perception becomes reality that we haven't improved it. So we need benchmarks in transportation funding as well.
Charlie, you referred a few moments ago to what happened with the past scholarship program, which has often been compared to as vouchers. Do you think that the governor has repaired his relationship with Republican legislative leaders since last year's budget, or is there something that needs to happen to move forward?
I think you'd have to ask them, Francine, but I don't think he has. I don't get the sense that he's gone out of his way to repair a relationship that was very, very important, because he had a lot of trust and he didn't tell them the truth. I do want to make a comment, though, if I might, and we can come back to that, about the caller, because he really kind of hit the nail on the head. The two words that I had used previously that Governor Stack alluded to were accountability and results. And when we're asking for more and more and more of the taxpayers, we have to be able to show them that their money was used in the fashion that it was intended, i.e. accountability, and that we have some results to show for it. Because right now we've had negative results. Our educational system hasn't improved, despite the fact that we've poured more and more and more money into it. And right now, Josh Shapiro is asking for a 7% plus increase in state spending, much of it for education. And you've got to ask, how many taxpayers, how many families across Pennsylvania are getting a 7% increase this year? And I can tell you, it's not very many.
Right.
Governor Stack, what changes would you like to see schools make beyond getting additional funding?
I'd like to see, first of all, we need, in Philadelphia, this is an ongoing issue, the issue of safety in schools, where if a kid can't feel like they can attend school safely, how are they going to learn when they have all kinds of other environmental distractions and problems? You won't even be able to diagnose if someone's having a special ed issue or some kind of dyslexia. So first, you got to have safety. And secondly, I'd like to see smaller classes, and I want to see more accountability from teachers. I want to see the money needs to go into the classroom, and quality teachers who, many of them we all know, we've had teachers in our lives that have made an impression on us. There are quality teachers that are unique and make an impression on children. They should be rewarded for this. There should be incentives in their pay, because they're paid terribly, I still believe, school teachers. So the best teachers should be able to be rewarded. They should be incentivized, and I'd like to see the idea of tenure or experience. If you're not a good teacher, that should not be something that's rewarded. So that's what I would like to see in schools. I'd like to see smaller classrooms, safer classrooms, where talented teachers are rewarded for their performance.
We talked a moment ago about the past scholarship program. Governor Stack, do you foresee any scenario where that gets revisited this year in the budget?
I think so. I think so, because the governor has said that he wants to do that again. So I think he'd be in a little bit of a quandary if one way or another he didn't go forward. We previously had Governor Ridge who had made commitments. I'm gonna push the voucher bill, and he went out and pushed the voucher bill, and it lost. And he said, "I pushed the voucher bill. There you go." But I think. And then we didn't revisit it.
Well, I got the EITC, which is a fabulous program, and I don't know that there's anybody in the Commonwealth right now that wouldn't say that the EITC is a great program.
But no, and I was just saying at that point in time, with that particular voucher bill, that the governor was like, "I've done my part," and I think Governor Shapiro has said, I want to do more. So he's basically put the pressure on himself that he's got to move forward on this. So the scenario of how that happens, I'm not sure, but I see it happening.
A bill that basically would be the past scholarship program moved through the Senate Education Committee last week. Do you see this making its way into the House eventually?
I do, and I agree with Governor Stack. This show would be a lot more fun, Francine, if we argued about more.
I know,
but I want to get back
I'm
to
going to try and get to something.
I want to say, we'll find one. I want to go back to something that the governor said a moment ago that I agree with as well, and that is that with respect to teachers, to have incentives for the high-performing teachers, but also to have disciplinary measures, if you will, for the low-performing teachers is really important. And do I have 10 seconds to get on a rabbit trail?
Yeah, go right ahead. You're fine.
I just want to get down one rabbit trail because you asked what we would like to see in public education. There's something I think would be really, really, really helpful in public education, and that is the reintroduction of civics education, because so many of our students simply don't know about the greatness of this country. Last week, I was asked by the United States District Court in Philadelphia to come down and speak at a naturalization ceremony. And as you may know, Francine, I'm a naturalized citizen myself, a citizen by choice. And I was thinking about something that I had talked about when I ran statewide, and I'd love to see happen. Your old friend John Rafferty actually proposed it in the Senate a number of years ago, and that would be to have every graduating senior from a Pennsylvania high school be required to pass that citizenship test that new Americans are required to take.
We're going to head back to the phones. Linda is calling from West Grove. Go ahead, Linda.
Hi, how you doing? I was calling about the teachers. You said they should get paid more, the ones that do more. I think if they would teach school, period, they should be rewarded. But the stuff that they're teaching nowadays, I don't think any of them should be awarded. And the money goes to the unions anyway. What about the kids? You need to have school choice and get rid of the government schools because they're not learning nothing in school. Not a damn thing. Thank you.
Well, just jumping on that, that is part of the perception, which is discouraging. And it needs to be turned around because we realistically in the public, we've got the public education system. It's large. It's required. It has to perform better. And we talked about incentives before. It needs to do a better job. We need to help it do a better job. At the end of the day, you want it to be in a situation where it attracts more students away from other options. They're expensive. Catholic schools or other private schools draw students because they perform. And it's challenging, particularly in this day and age with kids with all the distractions going on, all the other issues in the post-pandemic world. Being a teacher is a very hard job. Running schools is a very hard job. The distractions are enormous. So no one's saying that that's not the case, but clearly the perception is, as the caller indicated, that they're not doing a good enough job, and that's a public relations issue that needs to be addressed because we can't keep putting Band-Aids on things. And I think there's nothing wrong with if a school's failing, if a public school is failing time and again, then that school should be closed. And if a school that's 10 blocks away is performing well, it should be encouraged. It should get more money. It should be able to promote itself and draw more students. And students who want to go there should be able to.
Charlie, I'd like to shift our focus a little bit and talk about higher education. There's sort of two dueling programs right now, one being offered by the Shapiro administration that would make higher education more affordable for someone attending a state system or community college school, and then a separate one being promoted by Republican lawmakers called Gerow, PA. Can you just talk briefly about that, and do you see any synergy where there's shared goals that maybe this can become something that actually moves forward through the legislative process?
There may be. The state system of higher education, as you know, Francine, is really struggling, and there are some solutions to its success. They've been blocked, unfortunately, over the course of the past number of years. As we move into the real nuts and bolts of the budget cycle right now, I'm not sure whether the governor's idea of combining the PASHE system with community colleges is going to work. I don't think it will. But I think the Senate proposals may have the beginning, at least the foundational aspects of a discussion.
Another one of the governor's proposals is to increase the minimum wage. I know this is something that Governor Wolf was calling for when he was in office. It's been several years since Pennsylvania's minimum wage has been increased. Do you think this is the year, and what would it take to get something like this passed?
I would like to see it be the year. As someone whose grandfather was a congressman who helped pass the first minimum wage 25 cents, and I always say we haven't gone up that much further if you add in inflation. So people say all the time, if you increase the minimum wage, or let's say the chamber guys say, you're going to kill jobs, you're going to kick businesses out. What we've seen with states that have been beating us in job creation and economic development is their higher minimum wages have increased their job creation and have vitalized their economic energy. So I think we're overdue. I think there's room to negotiate how much we increase it, but I would hope we would be able to do it this year. Whether we would be able to, it may be an issue that gets agreed upon a further discussion after this budget cycle, because that's the way sometimes folks avoid doing what they should do right now. So we'll see if that happens. Not to be cynical about the political process.
How would an increased minimum wage affect business in Pennsylvania?
Well, you've seen how it does affect business, and where it has been imposed just recently, McDonald's and whatnot have laid off workers, have gone to increased automation, et cetera, all the things that folks have suggested would happen. But here's the point, Francine. How many people are truly working at minimum wage right now? And if you are, you need to look a little further. because you can go down to, any convenience store right now and get a job at $17, $18, $19 an hour with benefits, with a signing bonus, with all sorts of goodies thrown in on top. So to say that there are only opportunities at the minimum wage is really, really today a little bit far afield. The market has taken care of this problem, as it should.
Just to piggyback on that, if you can find what used to be a traditionally minimum wage job and it's paying $17, $18, $19 an hour, does the rate even matter at this point?
That's my point. That's precisely my point.
How does Pennsylvania compare to other states' minimum wages?
I think our surrounding states have significantly higher wages. I know even in, if you look at in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State raised their minimum wage to a substantially higher number than ours, and at one time had created a substantial number of jobs. So I think it's ultimately an issue of competitiveness, and it's something that you can put on the board when people are talking about where they're going to live. I think pragmatically, it's important to do it from a standpoint of social justice, and I think it's going to make a difference in our economy, and people are going to have more money to spend, and more money to spend. They're going to spend it, and we're going to create a jolt in our economy, and it's going to be a positive one.
Governor Shapiro, go ahead, Charlie,
I was just
please.
going to say, at this point, it really is, in many respects, an academic discussion because of the fact that you've got the plethora of jobs at very, very high levels. So what we're talking about now with respect to the minimum wage is really at the margins. And the problem is that those folks at those outer margins are going to be negatively impacted by an increase in the minimum wage because, bluntly, there aren't going to be those jobs available. And the difference between a job at the minimum wage and no job is important to those people.
Governor Shapiro is also proposing legalizing recreational marijuana in Pennsylvania. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what's the voter sentiment right now on that issue?
You're going to get me in a lot of trouble here, Francine, because I'm one of the Republicans that thinks he's right on that issue, and I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble as a result. Ultimately, it seems to me that it's an economic issue, and at a point where, as Governor Stack will tell you, many of our surrounding states, in fact, the majority of states have legalized recreational use. We're going to be at an economic disadvantage, and here's the opportunity to bring in a significant amount of money without raising taxes. And to me, that's at the bottom line. And it also is, in my judgment, inevitable that we're going to get there. And let me just say parenthetically, before people think I'm some sort of radical dope smoking.
I can't wait to go after you.
Radical dope smoking nut. I've never done it. I never will, just by phraseology of personal impact. But when medical marijuana was an issue, I was the first Republican to say we ought to go with medical marijuana, and I got heavily criticized. This was back in the days when only Dalen Leach was for it, and I said, well, I better rethink my position. I said that tongue-in-cheek. But then along came a lot of Republicans, and today polling suggests that 90 or 95% of Pennsylvanians think it's a good idea.
The polling is wrong. People who believe that recreational marijuana is a good idea haven't seen the effects. I'm just one of those people, and I'm the Democrat now, but I'm in favor of medical marijuana. But there are places I've been in our country where it's legalized marijuana, and when you walk down the street, I smell weed, and I see people who don't succeed. It's an example of selling our soul to the devil. There's no question about the revenue numbers that we can bring in by legalizing it, but I just think we're going to create all kinds of other health issues. And when we set a terrible example for young people when we say, well, it's legal. Well, so they're fine. And I know booze is legal.
Let me just say this, though. I mean, if you want to believe that a lot of folks aren't smoking weed already. Right. We need to come to a different neighborhood. Right. But now you've got the problem of weed laced with fentanyl and all sorts of really ugly things in the black market of marijuana in this state. I think you could clean it up if it were legal.
Maybe. I mean, that would be a worthy consideration when Charlie says that, but I just don't know if, and I do believe you can get addicted to weed, and, I've seen many people and had personal experiences with that issue. So I think once it's legal and people who otherwise would not smoke marijuana will be smoking it, and perhaps they become addicted to it, and then they'll say, you know what, I've heard, as Charlie said on PCN, there is weed laced with fentanyl, and I could use a little boost in my weed because the old weed, the legal stuff, it's just not doing it. So that's just my view on a lot of people who suffer from addiction. That could happen. So I just would hate to see that happen.
Interesting side note here. One of your predecessors, Mark Singal, former lieutenant governor and acting governor of Pennsylvania, and I are on a television program here in the mid-state.
I got to tune in.
We disagree on that issue. You know, the Democrats said no, and the Republicans said, okay, I'll be for it. But I will tell you this, Mark Singal's coming around.
Well, I like Mark Singal.
He's shifting his opinion a little bit.
One last question before we run out of time. We're roughly about 6 weeks away from the budget deadline. What are your early predictions? What do you think passes? What fails?
Well, I meant to add this in too, Francine, because I know I'm going to get in trouble. You said, was there a budget player that I thought was important? And it was a guy like Vince Fumo. And Vince Fumo, no matter, he was in the minority his whole career, could literally see the whole field of play and knew how to resolve things and could calculate what day a budget would get done. So I think that if I'm going to forecast when this thing gets done, I'll just go for, as usual, I'll go for July 14th. And I think that's about all they can take. But I see it a lot of standing around for a while, and then suddenly the ball starts moving and then slows down, and there'll be accusations and arguing and insults, and that's how you get a budget done.
Charlie, get the last
word. I already said earlier in the program July 15th, so we're a day apart, Gov, and you have the Prince of Darkness on your side.
There you go.
Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. PCN's Ellen Frantz spoke earlier with Representative Mandy Steele about her legislation to repeal the ban on Sunday hunting.
We are joined today by Representative Mandy Steele. What is some background on this package of bills you've proposed?
Hi, so glad to be here. Sunday hunting is something that many of our hunters have wanted for a long time. It's an old blue law, the prohibition on Sunday hunting, that was common all over this country. Most other states have lifted the ban on Sunday hunting, and we're trying to get that done here in Pennsylvania for a number of reasons.
So there's 3 bills in this package. Could you briefly describe what each of the bills have to do with Sunday hunting?
Sure. We did a package of bills after consulting with a number of stakeholders and bringing together the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau to help us craft this package of legislation. And the reason for that was to advance legislation that would lift the ban on Sunday hunting and also address the needs of the farming community. The farmers are in Pennsylvania seeing significant loss from crop damage, and so they feel that Sunday hunting would be a help in that. And at the same time, they wanted us to direct the Game Commission to create a database of registered hunters that farmers could go to easily find someone to come and hunt their property. And they also wanted us to ensure that the Board of Commissioners, the Pennsylvania Game Commission Board of Commissioners, that is, was required to have a board member that had a background in farming. And the final piece of this package of legislation would increase the violation, or increase the penalty for people who trespass onto farmers' land.
What has been the response from the hunting community about having an extra day to go out and hunt?
They're excited. They need it. This is something they've long advocated for. So many of our hunters are working 6 days a week, and they cannot, when they can't get out on Sunday, that means they can't hunt. I can say that it's true for families too, who are really short on time nowadays. I have 4 kids. We have a very busy family, and without Sunday hunting, we aren't able to get our kids out. Saturdays are filled with activities and sports, and that's true for thousands and thousands of families across this Commonwealth. And hunting is an incredibly important area of economic importance in the Commonwealth. And we also simultaneously have our wildlife biologists telling us that our forests are being damaged beyond repair by a herd that is too big. And so we need Sunday hunting to help manage that herd. So we've got hunters and families and working people and farmers and wildlife biologists all telling us that we need to lift this ban on Sunday hunting.
How can people such as hikers or anyone else who spends a lot of time in the woods stay safe during this extra day of hunting that they weren't initially prepared for?
Well, that's a great question. So I am from a family of hikers. We're outside all the time. My 12-year-old is actually hiking a pretty good stretch of the Appalachian Trail this year, which we're so excited about. It's very important to wear orange if you're out hiking around hunters. But it's also really important to highlight the safety of hunting. We've got data from Pennsylvania and from all over the country about the safety. When there are hunting accidents, they're rare. The safety has improved so much in the past 50 years since we've introduced hunter education courses, et cetera. And when accidents do occur, it is almost never hunter and non-hunter. It's almost always a hunter injuring another hunter or him or herself. And again, those instances are so rare. I mean, there are typically 12 in the entire Commonwealth per year and non-fatal. Very safe.
What is the benefit of having somebody with an agriculture background on the board for the state game commissioners?
Well, so much of hunting occurs on farmland. And so that knowledge can really help form policy that's beneficial to farmers. And we've got to prioritize their needs.
Final question. What has the response been from your colleagues in the House about this package of bills?
People get it. They're on board. I think we can move it pretty easily through the House and Senate. And I know that the governor would be interested in getting on board with something like this. Again, it's safe. So many groups are calling for it, and there's a scientific need for it too. So it's pretty common sense, and I'm excited to be able to advocate for it.
Representative Mandy Steele, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That concludes today's show. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow to discuss voter ID in Pennsylvania with House State Government Committee members Representatives Joe Webster and Brad Roy. That's tomorrow morning live at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.